Get started with Nora. Nora, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you so much. I am sharing my screen for the first time, but seems like I'm not. I'm just going to share with you that I have been very honored to publish 2 books in the last few years. Rest in My Shade is a poem about displacement told or narrated in the voice of an uprooted olive tree and accompanied by fine art pictures by Palestinians living all around the world. That was published by Interlink Books. And my new book, I Found Myself in Palestine, Stories of Love and Renewal from Around the Globe, is an anthology, also published by Interlink Books. I am a Fielding alum from the HOD program. I got my PhD in 2000 and just thrilled to be part of this alumni event. Talking about the new book, I Found Myself in Palestine. It has come out at a very, very strange time. It is, we're in the middle of a horrible global pandemic, a global economic crisis, and also a very uplifting and hopeful new movement for racial justice. And so in that context, it's a little bit strange to talk about this book. On the other hand, it's also a good time for all of us to be reading and to be reading stories that are hopefully inspirational. I Found Myself in Palestine is an anthology, and it grew out of my own experience being what's called an ajnabiya, which means foreigner in Palestinian Arabic. And I am a foreigner in 2 particular ways. One is that for about 35 years, I've been doing Palestinian human rights work. And in that context, as a non-Palestinian, I am an ajnabiya, a foreigner, with a particular, which brings a particular connotation and history to it, which could either be one of oppressor and invader, or it could be one of solidarity. About 5 years into my Palestinian solidarity work, I also married a Palestinian and became a daughter-in-law, a sister-in-law, an auntie, a wife, of course, and also a mother to 3 Palestinian American daughters. And that made my experience as an ajnabiya, a foreigner, even more entrenched and I think poignant. In 2004, we moved our family to Palestine, where we lived in Jerusalem for 8 years and in Ramallah for 5 years in order to raise the girls in a bilingual and bicultural environment. And I did lots of different international development and community development and advocacy work at that time. And the book, I Found Myself in Palestine, grew out of that experience. So it's unrelated to my dissertation, but very much related to my life since graduating from Fielding. What I realized in my conversations, both with Palestinians and other foreigners living in Palestine over the 13 years that I lived there, is that the experience of being an inside outsider in the Palestinian community is one that has many facets, a lot of raw pain, and also some incredibly, some incredible beauty and opportunity being a member of the Palestinian community, but not being Palestinian myself. And so I reached out to other foreigners with long and deep experiences in Palestine to find out and learn about their experiences, and to ask them to write pieces for this anthology. I didn't ask people who just visited Palestine or had a deep experience. There are a couple of anthologies out there by famous people or writers who visited Palestine and wrote about their experiences. This book is really different. First of all, the contributors are, except for one, non-writers. They're just regular people from all different backgrounds and different professions, and also from different countries around the world. We have contributors from Japan and Bolivia and Chile, Sudan, Germany, and the US, the UK, all over. And also, there are people who are not writing about Palestine per se, but they are writing about how their experiences with Palestine and Palestinians have been transformative for themselves. And this is important because like Black Lives Matter, in the Palestinian movement, we feel it's very important for Palestinians to speak for themselves and for foreign voices not to take up space away from Palestinians. So I really want to emphasize that the contributions in this anthology are not about Palestine. They relate to Palestine, and you certainly learn a lot about Palestine by reading the book. But the focus is on how Palestine and Palestinians and our experiences as foreigners have transformed us. Another thing I would say is that of the 23 writers that are presented in the book, almost nobody story was written all at once. In other words, people wrote drafts and then there were long and deep conversations back and forth as I asked questions and pushed people to go deeper into their experiences. And through that process, several writers kind of dropped out. They felt that the process of really reflecting back was too difficult. In some cases, it was too painful. And they just dropped out. The ones that stayed in the book and are represented in the anthology, I think are a very diverse group of stories that are raw, they're insightful, they're funny sometimes, and they're tragic sometimes. And from what I hear from people who've read the whole book, it as a collection gives real insight into issues of identity, of belonging, as well as insight into the Palestinian culture. I'm not sure what else to say about this particular book, except that it's really different from all other books about Palestine because it's so personal. It's stories of love and renewal from around the globe. So in it, each of us reflect on our family relationships, if we're members of Palestinian families, or on experiences we've had that are really unique. And I think to read them is really an honor. So I give a lot of credit to the writers in the anthology and also to my publisher, Interlink Books, which makes an effort and a contribution by making stories about Palestine available to English readers, and especially in the United States. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions and also to hearing the publishing stories of my colleagues.
Great, thank you. I had a question for you. And fascinating. This is fascinating to hear about your books. Can you talk about your writing process? How you basically figured out how to write what you were writing? Was there a certain process that you found that worked well for you? Maybe an inspiration for other folks that are looking to write, but what process did you use to write your book? What was your personal thoughts?
Well, I definitely was important for me to write my own story first, and to try to put words around reflections that were unfinished. They were, unclear. The writing process was for me a process of clarifying and coming to new insight. I think that was true pretty much of all of the writers. It was also a process of conversation with other people about what was common or similar in our experiences, and also what was very different. And then, because it's an anthology, there was an ongoing process of figuring out what should be included in the book, and trying to reach out to make sure that there was enough diversity. I think I was successful in some ways and not successful in other ways. I don't have, for example, any LGBTQ stories in the book, although I tried. And all I can say is a process, really focus on the process of discovery and of introspection, as opposed to a focus on the product and the outcome.
And then can you talk a little bit about your time at Fielding and how your work and your studies here at Fielding may have contributed to your book and to your writing and your process?
Absolutely. I think my time at Fielding and my Fielding experience contributed tremendously, both in terms of being a member of a community that is so dynamically developing. It's a real learning community. I think that has affected the way that I approach everything, including this particular project. It was a learning project for me, definitely not a teaching project. And secondly, my experience learning in community with other people. I think that I could have written a whole book about my own experience as a foreigner, but I was more interested in creating a community of people that were also looking at those same issues at the same time. Yeah, I can also say that the experience of focusing on structural inequality through my learning at Fielding affects everything that I do, including my writing and my commitment to making sure that the harder issues are also dealt with, as they are in this book.
Thank you for that. And we do have a question in the chat from Marc. He asks, Nora, how did you shift or change? Who did you become as a result of writing and editing your book? Great question.
It is a great question. I think that it helped me to broaden the way that I engage with English readers, and especially US people, about Palestine. I think previously I had focused mostly on political issues, and this book helped me to shift and broaden my desire to really put human issues, including their political aspects, more at the forefront of my work.
Great. Thank you so much, Nora. I appreciate your time and
Thank you for the
fascinating
opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. We're going to go ahead and shift over to our next author, Dr. Kerry Arnold. We will hear about, I believe, your latest book, your most recent book.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen and put information about the book up here. Let's see here. This book was just released actually on July 1st. So I'll tell you a little bit about how it kind of came into being. It's Fielding's fault, of course, that this even was produced. My dissertation was on the silenced female leader. And my work was studying executive women who felt actually silenced in that executive role. And I was studying a nuance of leadership that wasn't really investigated to the point where I felt like it explained a phenomenon. And what we notice in the literature is that leadership is sort of this unnamed entity that silences employees. But I didn't see any research around what it was like to already be in leadership and experience that phenomenon. And so that was my dissertation. And the coaching community was interested in this topic. And so I started speaking on it. And what ended up happening was people were asking me questions that I couldn't answer specifically because the dissertation was more of a focused research project. And that sort of led me back into the research. I went back in and I became a fellow with Fielding with their Institute for Social Innovation. And I opened back up my IRB and I tripled my sample size, and I was able to include much more of a diverse audience because some of the questions I was asked was, how does the experience differ? How does it differ based on age? How does it differ based on industry? And how does it differ based on some of those intersections that I didn't really get a chance to fully explore? So after going back into the research, and studying all of these women, 65 plus women, the original audience that asked the questions at these conferences, I couldn't go back to and say, I have your answers now. And so it really left me no choice but to write the book. And I felt like I needed to honor the women who had participated. And it was interesting. I think researchers have a lot of problems, but for me, finding women to participate in my study was not one of them. I had more women raising their hand wanting to be included than I actually had capacity to interview. So my work culminated into this book, which was finished, I'm trying to remember exactly when. It was probably finished the beginning of 18. No, am I thinking about that right? Probably mid 18. And I was fortunate enough to find an agent who really believed in the topic. And she started shopping for a publisher and was able to secure me one. But then COVID hit. And so, someone still has to manufacture the book. It doesn't just birth itself. So I wasn't sure exactly how it would release, if it would release on time. So I was really excited that it was able to come out this year. And the timing is interesting too, especially given how COVID has become almost a spotlight on the silenced. And even though my research is on executive women, there's this phenomenon that I think impacts the body when someone feels like they should have voice, but they don't. And what happens in that situation? And so when I look out on the horizon of what's happening in society and with the Black Lives Matter movement and just what's happening in the political landscape, I think it's an interesting time for this book to come out, even though it was more of a nuanced research project around executive women. The people who are reviewing it and reading it are actually asking me questions about how it's more generous and maybe generalizable than originally intended. So anyway, that's a little bit about the history of it, how it was versed. It was certainly a labor of love. And I don't know if the research is ever finished. I don't think this work around voice is ever finished. I think it's a journey we all have as adults in the world, is how do I speak in a way that can be heard? And how do I leverage my voice in a way that actually invites dialogue versus shutting it down? And because the silenced aren't just silent, they actually use a lot of language. It's just sometimes the language they're using doesn't fit with the dominant discourse. And so part of having an effective voice, that's some of the research findings, was really understanding what it is that we say that can be heard. How does our audience need to receive our words? How do we pivot in our messages, not to assimilate or to be something we're not, but to honor and be fluent in the language of our situation and the way people are speaking, so that our words can actually land on receptive ears. So I'll pause there and see if there's anything else, Hillary, you'd like me to respond to.
Sure. Actually, I have a couple questions. So, and thank you so much for sharing this. I'd love to read your book. How did you find the women to interview? How did you find those women, and how did they know to raise their hand to talk to you? How did that come about?
It was more snowball, research, where I put out the initial requests for participants, and did that through my network, did that through LinkedIn, did that through professional channels. And what ended up happening is people just started contacting me. I heard about your research. Can I participate? I also had coaches who knew, executive coaches, leadership coaches who work, a lot predominantly with women, who heard about the research and told their clients about it. And so it was really word of mouth. I didn't have to search too far. In fact, I had women in other countries contacting me, and I did limit it to women in the United States. They did include one woman who was an American in another country, but it just showed there's something here. And it was almost like I got picked, like Dr. Arnold picked me for her research, and it was a chance for them to actually tell their story. And I even referenced that a little bit in the book, that just that act alone gave them some voice. And it's interesting, I want to go back to something Nora said. There was also this phenomenon that when women told me their story, it did happen a couple times where it was just too painful. And then they retracted and said, don't include me. Even though I've already given you my 90-minute interview and you've transcribed it, because I would always send back the transcript, them reviewing it sometimes brought healing, and sometimes the pain reemerged. And so there was a couple times where women was just like, it's too much. I'm glad I got the chance, but I don't actually want to be included in your book.
Wow, that's fascinating. Looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. And since we have a smaller group, why don't you just come on camera and ask those questions, Marc and Nora, if you mind popping on, and then we can have that.
Go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, go ahead, Marc.
I was trying to throw it over to Nora. So.
Thank you, Marc. My question was whether you came to any unique insights about the experiences of women of color, since we're in this moment right now, and that might be especially interesting.
Yeah, it's actually one of the main questions that led me back into the research. When I started speaking at conferences just after the dissertation, I had a little bit of a finding in my dissertation, but I just didn't feel like I had enough. And so I went back in, and what I was able to discover was that, some women who feel silenced in their role can heal in place. Like, they can still stay in the organization or the community that has silenced them, and find voice and be very successful. But the majority of the women I interviewed, that was not true for them. They had to leave their current position to find voice. And leaving alone was not an act of recovery. It's not a flip of the switch. Like, the recovery process was a couple years on average. What I learned from the non-white women was that leaving a job is an act of privilege. Having those options to say, you know what, I have resources, I'll put my resume out. That thinking alone is very privileged. And so what I noticed with women of color is that they stayed and suffered in a position that was continuously silencing them, and their recovery was much more difficult. And in some cases, they couldn't describe their recovery. And so that was a finding in and of itself, is that only less than 25% of the women I actually studied could actually say, I could stay in the organization that silenced me and stay successful and find voice, even less so for women of color. And so for me, that was sort of a call to notice, a call for awareness, a call for healing, a call for at what cost sometimes do women stay. And again, it's across the board, but it was certainly much more apparent with women of color.
Kerry, sorry, please.
No, I was just going to say you had a question. I was going to give you the
so
floor.
just a comment about the pain, and then a question. one of the things that drove a bunch of stuff, whether it's workplace trauma or actually abuse in so-called high-performance workplaces, has been some of the research that I've tried to tie into. So I thank you for all that work, and especially communicating what that pain can even feel like, let alone what to do about it.
Thanks.
I'm curious if you included yourself in it, whether directly or indirectly, in terms of silenced or sidelined women. In all the, you've had a lot of different roles, it sounds like, whether teacher, EBC, and the other pieces. How would you place yourself in those? And thank you.
Oh yeah, I'm in there. I mean, my book is not about me, and I was really careful. You know, my community didn't change with all my different roles, and so when we're silenced professionally, it's not like we can just run away from that. But yeah, I had to do my own research, and that was definitely part of my dissertation. And I do reference slight windows of my experience in the book. Primarily, though, I wanted it to be about the women I researched. But Marc, since you asked me a question, I want to redirect to one more thing that I think is really critical, is that there was no villain in my story. I am just as capable of being someone else's silencer as someone is capable of silencing me. And so there's no like, oh, it's the white men over this age working in this industry, or oh, it's these type of people. That was not true of any of the women I spoke to. Women silence women, sometimes more egregiously than men silence us. And I think that was really important for me to name in the book. It's that we're all capable of doing it to each other. It's just, what do we do when it happens, and how do we do it in a way that doesn't villainize? And one finding, Marc, was that men are often a big part of women healing. A big part of us finding voice efficacy again is that when men become really good allies and really good champions. And so there's an invitation from men in the book, because it deepens how we can partner with each other. And it's not just a gender against gender thing. Anyway, I wanted to throw that out as a finding as well.
Can I just do a build on for that?
Of course.
I find, in terms of my own coaching, you know, unofficially and so forth, is actually, same with boys, there is an incredible amount of male pain and that men will not deal with, and that actually just, and so lessons from your book and your experiences, even though it's for women, sounds like it could be incredibly useful for men as well.
Yeah, one of my sayings is when women find voice, everybody finds voice. And there is an invitation there for men as well. And there's an opportunity for there to be more research in that particular space of what is it like for the male experience now that we've captured the female.
Thank you for that work.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else that I missed in the chat box?
I think we got most of it.
Great.
And I do have questions for all of you when we get to the very end, but Marc, you are up.
Okay. First of all, thank you. And I'm really enjoying this, at least until right now. So, but this book came out in April, as some people have said. It's really coming out now because of COVID-19. It builds on other book that I wrote. It also includes a book from another Fielding alum, The Consciousness Quotient by Claude Coetzee, who kindly wrote the foreword to my book as well. What I did was just put a couple of quick PowerPoints together, and they're not meant, I'm not going to read the slide. If folks are interested, you can take a look afterwards. I uploaded a